Welcome back to the Integrated Rehab and Performance Golf Podcast. I am Nick, running the show here at the Integrated Rehab and Performance Center. Today we're going to talk about the pelvic tilt test, a really important test that we like to do as part of the movement screen. Again, we do 2 screens as part of the golf assessment. The movement screen, looking at how does this golfer's body move globally and how does it orient or relatively move on top of each other, right? So how do all the joints move? Really important we understand where a golfer's limitations are in mobility, stability, and motor control, so we don't try to force them into positions they can't even achieve while trying to address their golf swing specifically, okay? The other assessment we like to do is the swing assessment, where we look at 12 different swing characteristics. We see which ones are present, and then we like to see if there's an association with their movement screen findings and their swing findings, okay? So one of those really important tests in the movement analysis is the pelvic tilt test. So if I'm going to demonstrate this test accurately, or what it should kind of look like, it's this here. So we see I start in a little bit of a anterior tilt, and the goal here is to be able to tilt our pelvis backwards and then tilt our pelvis forwards again without getting a ton of motion through our upper body and lower body. We should be able to say, hey, pelvis, tilt backwards, now tilt forwards. We should be able to control that motion. This is what it should look like. Now you notice with me there's a little bit of shaking. That is an important finding still. So I have plenty of mobility there, but my brain is struggling to find the connection to tilt my pelvis backwards. That's a really important finding. It's still something worth addressing even if we are subjectively able to kind of do this test. Now, what you find with a lot of golfers is that this test is very foreign to them. They don't quite understand it. Okay, so you see here we're getting a lot of lower body. We ask them to tilt the pelvis, and we demonstrate it, and we see this. Again, that is could be a mobility issue. They simply just can't do it, right? The pelvis hasn't moved like that long enough, and we need to work on that. We need to prescribe some mobility drills that are specifically targeted and stability drills to get this motion back into the pelvis, okay? And then again, similar to how you saw with me, is that we're able to get some motion here, but we get a lot of shaking. Okay. Again, we want to make that a very clean motion that we can do when we need to, right? So why is this important to the golf swing? To tilt our pelvis backwards. Well, when we start at the swing, and here we're going to see some other compensation. So I'm going to demonstrate upper body. We test them to tilt their pelvis, and they do some upper body motion or lower body like we saw earlier. Why is this important? In the golf swing, we're going to start in a little bit of anterior tilt. That's pretty normal, right? But what we want is, as the downswing, is we start to posteriorly tilt or backwardsly tilt that pelvis, okay? This is very important for power, first and foremost, but also it's important for our mobility to stay back and twist, okay? If we don't twist, what we're going to do is stand up straight. As you see here, hips got pushed forward and I stood up. Lots of different reasons for why that might be happening. It's kind of an example of that early extension test, which I'll show you here in a bit. But if you can't posteriorly tilt that pelvis, you're going to have all sorts of issues with loss of posture and things like that, okay? So it is a very important test that the golfer is able to do this when they need to do it, okay? So first we want to see, are they capable of doing it at all? And then we want to be able to assess, are they actually doing it in their golf swing? Is it, have they put it into their sequencing in the swing, whether they know it or not, to posteriorly tilt that pelvis? And there's a few tests in the swing part of the assessment that will come out as they'll have findings if they can't posteriorly tilt. Again, there's other movement restrictions that might show those as positive findings, but one of those being the posterior pelvic tilt. So let's show that one of these tests is the early extension test. So for this test, we draw a line from the back of the glute all the way down in the down the line view. And then we have the golfer just take a swing. And now me demonstrating here with a slow swing, kind of over exaggerating things. But what you'll see is that on the downswing, my hips kind of shoot forward and we have space between here. What we expect is the right glute to start in that space, and then as we swing, our left glute should take over that space before we see any daylight there. Again, not happening. Quite a few things we'll find in the movement assessment that'll result in this, one of those being the pelvic tilt. Okay. Now, going forward here, we see a client who does a pretty good job of actually maintaining that space. So just a demonstration of this early extension line coming back as negative, right? He's doing a pretty good job on the downswing, where his right glute in this case is keeping that space. So good job there. Now, as we saw earlier, this was the same client who had a little shake and bake. We're still going to address that. The movement finding came out positive, so we're going to address that stability shaking there, which might not be showing in as an early extension here, but there might be another swing characteristic with him that is coming back. Hey, he's having some issue posteriorly tilting, resulting in whatever over the top potentially, or just distance, right? It's a power generator that is a little. It could use some better sequencing, right? Some stronger connection there with the brain and the swing, right? So worth strengthening and reinforcing. In this case, when it comes to early extension, he's doing just fine. Okay. Now, another finding that is correlated is S posture. So you just saw there briefly me really over-exaggerating that anterior tilt at setup. Again, that is a S posture with an excessive anterior tilt. Okay. A lot of times people with this excessive anterior tilt will come back positive on the pelvic tilt test that they cannot control or even have the mobility to get into posterior or backwards tilting of that pelvis. Now, another kind of thing that I'm over-exaggerating here is if I can't posteriorly tilt my pelvis or control that pelvis tilt, is I start to stand up. So I lose my address posture, my angles, and this might result in me coming over the top, as you see there. Okay, and we have lines that we can draw there to kind of prove this, right? But if we don't have control over our pelvis, loss of posture, over the top swing characteristic, early extension, like I mentioned earlier, all these things kind of have the potential of coming true. So we understand the glute and the core are major components in the golf swing. The glute being the king, the core being the queen. Okay, it turns out that the pelvic tilt test is a perfect test that incorporates both of these. If one of them is out of commission, the pelvic tilt test will show us. Okay, the glute attaches to the back of the pelvis and pulls it down, which will backwardsly tilt the pelvis. The core attaches to the front and top of the pelvis. So when it contracts, it'll pull the front of the pelvis backwards. So both of these are doing that backwards tilting. Really important that if one of these are offline, it's going to lead to things like early extension, right? If your glute isn't strong, we're going to lose distance. We're not going to be able to fix our over-the-top swing. As no matter how many drills we do, we're not going to be able to make a change there, or at least we're not going to be able to consistently make a change. Early extension drills aren't going to be able to make any change there if we're not assessing the mobility and stability, the strength in that pelvis to do these sort of motions, right? So it's really important that with our swing drills, we're also assessing the body. So let's take a closer look at some of these structures that we're talking about. When it comes to the pelvic tilt test, if we're having issues in mobility, a lot of times it is due to the lumbar spine. And one big cause of this is disc, right? So if the disc in the lumbar spine have lost some of their height, so in some case, whether it's disc desiccation, where the fluid in the disc is lost, whatever it might be, if there's a disc bulge due to some trauma, or we're not able to stabilize our spine in the golf swing or when lifting weights, right? This will cause the shear force in this lumbar vertebrae it's very high if we're not stabilizing using our core to do that job, right? So whatever it might be, this can cause some damage to these structures that will limit our mobility, right? In this case, if a disc a lot of times comes with a whole lot of pain, so this might be more in the rehab side of things, where we're doing more hands-on work actually with the Integrative Rehab and Performance Center, and we are building you back up really from the ground floor, retraining these patterns, starting with what we call an SFMA screen, and then working you into that more golf-specific thing, right? Building you up back into golf and playing golf pain-free, and then into that performance side where we're not just trying to get you back pain-free, but we're working on all the things that we're doing on this more performance side, working on our mobility, stability still, and our strength and power, speed, coordination, sequencing, timing, all those things. So besides disc, normal bony changes or arthritic changes in the lumbar spine can lead to loss of mobility. And a big cause of loss of mobility is actually this thing we call lower cross syndrome. And the general idea here is the hip flexors are a big role in this. So we're going to look first at the psoas, and the psoas minor and major. This does hip flexion, so it pulls the femur towards your chest. You can think of it. Or if the foot is planted or anchored, it'll pull the lumbar spine towards your femurs, towards your legs, right? But what happens in our day-to-day lives when we're doing so much sitting, you hear about this a lot, is these muscles will get what we might call shortened, right? But the idea here is if we understand something called gamma motor tone, if I'm to simplify that, it is when the muscles are in a chronically shortened state, the nervous system needs to understand what's happening at the joints. And when these muscles are shortened, we're not getting feedback from the joints, things like that. What's going to happen is the normal resting state of these muscles is going to become smaller. Now, this doesn't mean these muscles are literally shrinking in size. Typically, the issue here is your normal threshold for discomfort will decrease before you start to feel that stretch, that uncomfortable stretch. It is because the gamma motor neurons will shrink in size. They will become smaller, which will decrease your threshold for stretch. Now we can train that back in where these motor neurons are going to say, hey, we're safe when we go in more extended stretch positions. We can allow that to happen before we start to feel that feedback from the gamma motor neurons, right? Motor neurons. So again, not literally shrinking in size, but the nervous system is playing a role to make you feel discomfort when these muscles start to stretch, right? And another big reason for this is strength. Okay, so it seems counterintuitive, but it's very important to strengthen the hip flexors. If they are weak and they're not being used, then this is something we might have to put into our programming to allow the pelvis to tilt backwards again, right? We're limiting the influence of these hip flexors to keep our pelvis in a frontward tipped way, right? Like it is when we sit. Now, another important muscle here to look at is the erector group on the back. Now, these will pull on the back of the pelvis again and lead to an anterior pelvic tilt if these are chronically shortened. An important idea here, again, is to lengthen these under tension in eccentric exercise. Okay, so another kind of important muscle involved in this idea of lower cross syndrome and anterior pelvic tilt. Now, we talked about the glute and its positioning. It attaches on the back of the pelvis here and on the back of the femur. Again, when this muscle shortens, it'll kind of tilt that or rotate that pelvis backwards. Really important to do this at the right time in the golf swing and with power, right, for many, many reasons. Okay, so we see its connection there on the femur. Really important for external rotation of the hip, all sorts of implications there. We need it to allow the hip to rotate into internal rotation, but also to forcefully externally rotate it and put some extension into this pelvis when the lower body is anchored or attached to the ground. Okay, good. And then we come back to the core here in the front. So we look at the rectus abdominis, really important muscle. Again, it attaches at the top of the pelvis. In the front, when that shortens, it will pull that into posterior tilt. So when we contract that, it'll pull the pelvis up, or if the pelvis is stationary or being stabilized, it'll flex the torso down, right? So all these really important components in understanding the pelvic tilt test. So a few things that we can do to address this pelvic tilt, some unique drills that we have here, is we're going to reteach the hamstrings how to do their role in pelvic tilt. Now, they do a lot of things, but one of them is they control the orientation of the pelvis. They attach at the bottom and back side of the pelvis, so when they shorten under contraction, they are going to do some backwards tilting of it. A great drill that we can use to re-understand, we can retrain the nervous system and our brain how to use our hamstrings to control and orient our pelvis, okay? So we're on our side, we have our feet flat against a box here or the wall, and again, what this is doing is it's kind of mimicking gait, so our nervous system is feeling that proprioception, it's feeling our feet against the wall, right? So it's in a way mimicking us in a standing position, which is the end goal here, is to start from the ground and then get back onto our feet where we can do it where we're full weight bearing. So in this case, our brain feels some proprioception of the feet, but otherwise we are non-weight bearing. That turns off the need to stabilize anything through this pelvis. A lot of times our issues here is that we use big, heavy mover muscles to do the stabilizing because we lose the ability and we don't understand how to stabilize with our small stabilizing muscles, okay? And so what we're going to do here is we are turning off the need for any big muscles to do any stability work there, right? And then we're going to retrain the brain to use the hamstrings, and we're going to train the hamstrings themselves how to do that posterior tilting, right? And we're going to get a little bit of an exercise through here. So as we do this, the idea here is we have our femurs at about 60 degrees relative to our spine, and we're going to think about pulling our feet across that wall, but we're not going to overcome the friction, right? So that's going to be just enough to turn our hamstrings on. If you do this, you will feel your hamstrings start to work to pull your feet kind of backwards here, sliding them across the wall, but not enough to actually slide them. Just that activation of the hamstring there will tilt, it'll pull on that pelvis, and you will feel your pelvis tilt backwards, okay? So now we understand what the motion feels like. We couldn't do that before standing up. Well, now we're on the ground, and we're going to start doing that. Okay, we'll do sets and reps for that. And then at the end, we're going to hold that contraction, and we're going to put our arm out at the same angle as our femur as we do this. And we're just going to hold both our hamstrings in a contraction there as we do that. Again, retraining the body to do a motion that it doesn't really like to do. When we see some of those pelvic tilt tests with some people standing up, right? This is a motion they do not know how to do it. They don't have the mobility for it. They don't have the stability or the motor control for it. We start here. This is a great drill to help kind of start the process of retraining that. Now another one here. Again, this is good for a lot of things, especially some dissociation issues where we can't dissociate our pelvis from our upper body. That'll come later with some of the other tests that we do in the movement analysis. But it's also good for pelvic tilt because we're just building in relative motion back into that pelvic complex there, the sacrum, pelvis, lumbar spine, and femur. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're laying on our side, taking away all the stability requirements, and then we are very, very subtly rolling. We are thinking about pushing our knee away from us without letting the whole body roll with it. And what that does is that is getting just a subtle counter nutation and nutation of the sacrum, which is just a forward and backward motion of the sacrum, and it's allowing the pelvis to go into that forward roll and backward roll. Okay, so we're doing some rotation here as well as a anterior and posterior tilting, and we are allowing that pelvis to understand, hey, you can move in your parts, you don't always have to move in your whole. Okay, because the pelvis, what we do when we're in that chronic anterior forward tilting is that's the pelvis and the sacrum and the lumbar spine all coming together, kind of tilting forward. And this drill is great for retraining, and we are relearning how to do subtle relative motion of one of those segments on top of the other. Okay, really good drill. A lot of times we have to start people here to rebuild some of that relative motion back in. Now another great drill here, we're going to get a big glute burn here. So we're starting on the ground again on our side, and we are training this glute, and you'll get a great burn out of this. We're going to build some stability into the glute here, but we're also retraining that glute how to fire when we want it to. You'll be surprised. A lot of people really need this drill. We're going to relearn how to use the glute. Okay, the glute is used for external rotation of the hip and extension, and this is really training a lot of that external rotation. So this bottom hip here, as we push that knee into the ground, is creating that motion that we want at the hip, and you're going to feel that hip on the bottom starting to burn. And we're using this foam roller. It gives us a little leverage off the ground. Okay, again, a very specific drill for a specific golfer who needs a few different things. They failed the pelvic tilt test, and some other testing revealed that it is the glute. It is definitely the glute that we need to retrain, and we have a bunch of processes and exercises that are going to help us get that glute, no matter what stage they are in, to start firing again as we roll forward and roll back. Again, these drills surprisingly hard as you start to do them. You'd be surprised at the burn and the difficulty that it might be to do some of these.